Ladies and gentlemen, here's the official real estate purchase agreement. At this point, you and the seller have agreed upon a price. It's time to get the contract signed. Once you have this signed, you have the property under contract, right? And now we can go and assign this contract to our buyer for a fee. But this is the official contract to get it under contract, guys. So I want to go through this. I'm going to go through every section. I am not the best person to read out loud. I will stumble over words, so be patient with me. But I want you guys to understand every part of this contract. If you're going to be using it, you need to understand it, right? You need to understand what's in it. You need to be able to explain it yourself. So be patient with me. We're going to take our time to make sure you understand this. Me and my attorney, we worked hard on this to be able to use this across the United States. It's only 3 pages. You can use it in any state. And this is it. We're going to go over it, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. For valuable consideration, the receipt and legal sufficiency of which are hereby acknowledged, buyer offers to purchase and seller upon acceptance agrees to sell and convey the property based upon the terms and conditions of this real estate purchase agreement. All right, so the first section is the parties. These are the people involved, right? So this real estate purchase agreement is made between the buyer, which is you, right? You put your name or your entity right here, who agrees to buy, and seller, which is the seller who you've been speaking to, right? Who you've been talking to, the seller of the actual property. Now, right here, let's say there's a married couple, their spouses, right? You don't necessarily have to put both of them on this contract. One will be just fine. They both obviously have to be willing and able to sign the closing documents later on. But on this purchase agreement, one person on that deed is just fine. Right now, if they're spouses and they do request to be both on the contract, great, put them both on the contract, no problem. Second note, you always want to confirm that this seller that you list here is the owner on the deed. There's 2 ways to do that. On our database where we downloaded our list and we sent out the letters, the name of the owner on that database is the name of record because we downloaded that data from basically the county. So that's the first way. The second way, every single county across the United States has what's called a GIS database. So let's say, for instance, Charlotte is in Mecklenburg County. If I go and type in Mecklenburg County GIS, there will be a database that pops up that I can click on, and I can enter the address, and it'll show me who's the owner on record. All public record, it will show me. Any county, you type that in, your county, GIS, and that's how you confirm the seller, the owner of record. So next section, section 2, we're talking about the property. This is where all the property information goes. The property identified below shall be deemed to include the entirety of the land and fixtures located at the address unless otherwise identified. The property is to be sold as is. Easy right here, guys, right? Street address, we put the street address, the state, the zip code, the county, and the assessor's parcel number, very important. This is the tax parcel ID. This, again, can be found in the database that we downloaded on our spreadsheet, right? It's right there, APN. We use APN to price the actual properties. So you can find it there, or you can find it on your county's GIS database. Okay, so the next section is the purchase price. Section 3, the purchase price. So obviously this is where we're going to put all the information about the price that you and the seller agreed upon. Let's say you and the seller agreed $100,000, right? And then we have earnest money and we have balance at closing. Earnest money deposit. Let's talk about it. You do need to put down earnest money. It does not have to be a lot of money. It can be $100, right? Me personally, I put down $250 on all my contracts. On the initial contract, I put down $250 for the earnest money, right? And I've done hundreds of contracts. I've never, maybe once or twice got pushed back and they wanted more. Okay, if you want a little bit more, we can go up, 500, whatever it may be. But guys, your earnest money deposit is protected in 2 ways. I'm going to tell you. This section down here is the due diligence period. We're going to talk about this next, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, you have a certain amount of time before to actually inspect the property, to perform your due diligence. If you terminate this contract within that time period, you get to receive your full earnest money back. Okay, and we'll talk about that more. The second way your earnest money is pretty much protected is when you go and find a buyer, you are asking, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about finding the buyers and stuff. You're going to ask your buyers for a non-refundable deposit. And that non-refundable deposit is going to cover your earnest money. Me personally, I always ask for a $500 non-refundable deposit from my buyer. That's how we weed out all the non-serious people. $500 is not a lot of money for a serious buyer, and it's non-refundable, so you get to keep that money, right? So technically, if my earnest is $250, but I'm getting $500 non-refundable from my buyer, I'm definitely covered, right? Plus $250. So those are two ways that you're going to be covered. Earnest money is not a big deal. Put down some money, $100, $200, whatever you want to put down, but put down earnest money. And that's going to be held with the escrow agent or the title company, right? And I put escrow, you're going to see throughout this contract, I have the attorney or title company throughout this contract. And I did that because I want to be able to use this contract nationally, right? In certain states are title company states. They facilitate the closing through title company. In other states are attorney states. They facilitate closings through attorneys. So, and that's a simple Google search to figure out which state you are in, which one, how they facilitate the closing. And we'll talk about that again in another chapter, but I wanted to put that on a contract so we are able to use this in every state. Last line is the balance at closing. So this is literally the purchase price minus the earnest money. So for easy example, let's say purchase price is $100,000 and earnest money is $500. The balance at closing is $99,500. Simple. That's the balance at closing. All right. Due diligence period. Section 4. Extremely important for us wholesalers. Why? Our earnest money is protected. We can terminate and everything within this time period. So let's talk about it. Seller agrees to maintain the property in its current condition, subject to ordinary wear and tear from the effective date of this contract until closing. Seller agrees to grant buyer and or buyer's representatives full access to the property from the date of this contract execution to the date of closing. Buyer has until blank at 5 p.m. to fully inspect the property. Any items not removed by the closing date will convey to the buyer. So right here, let's say, for instance, this is what I like to do. Let's say our closing date, you and the seller agreed on a 4-week closing date. I always like to have my due diligence period in a week before the closing date. So if it's a 4-week closing date, my due diligence period will end in 3 weeks, right? And you can just mark on your calendar when 3 weeks is out from today and just put that date right here. Or you can just put 3 weeks right here, whichever one you like. But during that time is the time that you have legally to inspect the property. And it's really, for us wholesalers, the time that your buyer gets to inspect the property and they go do their walkthrough, right? Now, if for some reason you can't find a buyer, or your buyer that you found, they decide they don't want to move forward anymore after their walkthrough, and you just can't find a buyer, you can terminate this contract before the due diligence period is up and receive your full earnest money back, right? I think it even says it right here. So let's go over it. Buyer may, and buyer's sole and absolute discretion, terminate this contract during the inspection period by providing written notice to seller and obtain a full return of the earnest money deposit. There you go. Says it right there in your contract. So your earnest is protected. You are protected. You just need to find a buyer and solidify that buyer before your due diligence period is up. Now, if you terminate after the due diligence period, you just lose your earnest money. That's it. All right, so that's another reason why I only do $250. If for some instance I didn't terminate before the due diligence period is up and it's after, I just lose $250, right? So no big deal. All right, on to the next section. We're talking about the closing date. This transaction shall close on or before. This is the closing date. What did you and the seller agree upon, right? Mine, a typical closing date is 4 weeks. But let's say your seller wanted to close fast and you have 2 weeks. Okay, put that here. 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. But if you do like a 2-week closing date, what should your due diligence period be? At least 1 week, right? 1 week before the closing date is when your due diligence period should end, at least, right? So you put the closing date here. At the office of an attorney or title company, mutually agreed upon by the parties. Time being of the essence, seller shall provide all requested documentation to the attorney title company as soon as possible so the title work can be initiated. Right here, we have the seller initials. If it's just one seller, you only need one initials, right? If it's husband and wife or whatever, they can initial right there. And then you initial right here, right? So that's just the closing date. That's self-explanatory. Next section, section 6, is the closing costs. All closing costs are to be paid for by the buyer. All liens and encumbrances shall be closed and paid in full by the seller. Any past dues, taxes owed for prior years, or any rollback taxes are to be paid for by the seller. Current year's taxes, HOA dues, or other items will be prorated at closing. So what does this mean? All closing costs to be paid for by the buyer. Remember, one of the benefits of coming with us, Mr. Seller, is we pay your closing costs. Now, guys, when you assign this contract and you have a buyer yourself, your buyer's going to pay the closing costs. And that's going to be in the assignment contract that we go over later. So you're not paying the closing costs. But in this contract, we have to state this, right? Because it is the buyer's responsibility. But you are assigning your rights to this contract that we're talking about now to your buyer. So your buyer is responsible for all this stuff, right? So I want to make that clear. I know you're like, oh man, do I need to come up with money to cover closing costs? No, you don't. Your buyer's going to cover that. Next sentence, all liens and encumbrances shall be closed and paid in full by the seller. All mortgages, any liens on the property, that's the seller's responsibility. That has nothing to do with you. And that will be paid for out of the seller's funds at closing. Any past dues, taxes, or any past stuff, any past taxes, anything in the past is the seller's responsibility, not yours. If there's $5,000 back taxes, the seller's responsibility, not yours. Current year's taxes, HOA dues, all this stuff this current year can be prorated, meaning, and the attorney will do all this. You don't have to do this. It'll be on the closing statement, the closing document. The seller's going to pay their portion, and you are going to pay yours. You meaning your buyer, again, not you. When you assign it, your buyer is going to take all responsibility for this stuff. So that's what that means. Next section, title. Seller shall convey title to the property by general warranty deed or equivalent unless otherwise agreed upon by the parties. A title search report shall be conducted by the attorney title company to ensure the chain of title is marketable and insurable. Attorney or title company is going to run a title report to make sure the chain of title is clear and that we can close. If chain of title is not clear, the attorney is going to try to get it clear. Whatever they have to do, pull estate files, talk to heirs, all that stuff, but that's their responsibility, not yours. All right. Section 8, title delays and extensions. If the title is found to be non-marketable and uninsurable by the agreed upon closing date, the parties agree to extend the closing date a minimum of 14 days in order to obtain marketable and insurable title. Mr. Seller, I know it's closing date, but on our contract, we agreed on an extension of 14 days if that title is not clear in order to get clear title. So you're telling that seller is agreeing that just because closing date has passed, Mr. Seller, you can't just go sign a contract with someone else because you have granted me an extra 14 days to get clear title. So that's all that means. You have an extension of 14 days only if title is not clear. Next section, section 9 is survey. I personally don't do this, but we wanted to include it in this contract because there are some states that they want surveys done, or some buyers or sellers, all that stuff. I just wanted to include it in the contract so it is there, so you guys are covered. Buyer may obtain a survey of the property before closing to ensure that there are no defects, encroachments, overlaps, boundary line, or acreage disputes, or other such matters. The cost of the survey shall be paid by the buyer. Self-explanatory. There it is. All right. Section 10, seller indemnification. Except as otherwise stated in this agreement, after recording of the deed, the buyer shall accept the property as is, where is, with all defects, latent or otherwise. The seller shall not be bound to any representation or warranty of any kind relating in any way to the property or its condition, quality or quantity, except as specifically set forth in this agreement. You're basically accepting all things as is with the property. That's all. We already told the seller we're buying it as is. This is their section to show that we're buying it as is. Whatever defects, we have our due diligence period, but we're buying it as is. Seller default, section 11. In the event of a seller default, buyer may elect to treat this agreement as terminated, in which case all earnest money paid by buyer hereunder shall be returned in full. If seller shall breach any terms of this agreement, buyer may proceed against seller for any claim or remedy the buyer may have in law or equity, which includes legal fees, specific performance, and or other damages as applicable. If the seller defaults, any of this that it says, as far as specific performance is a big one. They just try to sell to somebody else while you're under contract. They can't do that, right? You had the legal right to take legal action on them. That's what this is stating. Buyer default. Seller's remedies shall be limited to liquidated damages in the amount of the earnest money as set forth in Section 3. It is agreed that such payments and things of value are liquidated damages and are seller's sole and only remedy for buyer's failure to perform the obligations under this agreement. If the buyer defaults, if our buyer defaults, the only thing the seller can come after us is for the earnest money deposit. That is it. Section 13, the pre-marketing agreement. This is very important to have in every single contract, because this is what states or gives us the right to assign our rights to a buyer. This is what gives us that right to do that. If this is not in that contract, your contract, then you can't assign that contract legally, technically. But there is ways around that. If it's not in your actual contract, I've seen a lot of people, you can go up to this buyer section here and you can put like your name or entity / and or assigns, and that makes it an assignable contract. But our contract, this contract is assignable. Just wanted to make that note for you, just in case you're not using this contract. Buyer has the right to market its contract interest in this property and may assign it to another individual or entity. There it is. This is an assignable contract. Section 14, acceptance. Seller warrants that seller is the owner of the property or has authority to execute this agreement. Therefore, seller accepts the above offer and agrees to sell the property on the above terms and conditions. Seller is saying that they have the authority to convey this property and sell it. Section 15, entire agreement. This contract contains an entire agreement and shall supersede any and all other prior understandings and agreements, either oral or in writing, between the parties with respect to the subject matter hereof, and shall constitute the sole and only agreements between the parties with respect to the said property. That is a mouthful. All changes, additions, or deletions hereto must be in writing and signed by all parties. This is the full agreement here, no matter what was discussed or previously discussed or any of that. Section 16. This is important because every state, not every state, some states have different kind of state laws, different nuances, whatever. This is what allows us to use it in different states and with respect to the laws of that state. This note is to be governed and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of. You need to put wherever that deal is happening as far as the actual property, you need to put the state right here. Invalidation of any one of the terms of this agreement by judgment or court order shall not otherwise affect any of the other provisions which remain in full force and effect. Boom. All right. In witness whereof, buyer and seller have executed this contract, and it shall become legally binding as of the dates written below. This is just the actual buyer and seller signature, right? So buyer, you print your name and then you sign. This is us. And then you put the date here. Seller, they print their name, they sign, date there. Now, one last note. The contract execution date is the date that the last person signed the contract. So let's say, for instance, we signed the contract on January 3rd and we date it here. Seller signs the contract on January 5th and they sign and date it here. January 5th is the last date that one of us signed. So that's the contract execution date. And that is it, guys. That's the whole contract. Again, this contract can be used in any state. And it's a simple contract, 3-page agreement. And once this is signed, you officially have that property under contract, guys. It's exciting times. Let's keep it rolling. I'll see you in the next chapter.